Okay, we're going to continue with part 3 of the Deadly Training Materials series. When it comes to deadly training materials, you have several issues at play here. One is definitely, outdated training materials that were used in the classroom. Um, and we saw that in previous videos. But the other issue was also at the time that conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, it was clearly arguable that the training materials in the field were also very outdated. Now, I'm going to say something here. I do believe that when I raised these issues, CN then went to an electronic updating of field materials and whatever. Sorry, CN, that is too little, too late. May help with updates going forward, but that does not excuse the fact that CN Rail had to be using very outdated materials when frontline rail workers were actually doing their tasks, and worse, when they were training new employees in areas where the employees were new to the territory. So let's look at an example of this as it happened again in the case of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Now in the previous videos, especially like where I went over the Transportation Safety Board materials, I showed how in R13W0260, that was the number of the Transportation Safety Board report, there's only references basically to track switch number 21, 22, and 23. But if you looked at the witness statements for the people who were part of the crew the day that conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, and the crew consisted of 4 people. There was conductor trainee Jason Clooney. There was the supervising conductor, who, per my conversations with Tyrone Kowalski, the health and safety officer, the supervising conductor, even though he had several years with CN Rail, had never been trained in how to properly supervise a conductor trainee. But he did have several years at CN Rail. Why are you supervising a conductor trainee when you've never been told how to supervise that conductor trainee? And so that's why, you can have a supervising conductor 2/3 of a mile away from the conductor trainee he's supposed to supervise. And that conductor trainee is allowed to work in the dark, unsupervised, in unfamiliar territory, with nobody to double check the work, and in complete violation of SOR 87-150, Section 5. So let's look again here at what happened the day conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. That report from the Transportation Safety Board, again, referred to track switches 21, 22, and 23. But the witness statements referred not to track switches 21, 22, and 23. The people on the ground that day in their witness statements, and this is the supervising conductor, the locomotive engineer who was acting as a pilot locomotive engineer, who was familiarizing a locomotive engineer who was new to the territory. So both locomotive engineers were qualified, but one of them was new to the territory, and so he had to be familiarized with the territory. But in the witness statements, even that locomotive engineer who was new to the territory mentioned not track switch 23, but instead he mentions track switch 15. And I think it's in the supervising conductor witness statements, we see also that the other track switches were not track switch 21, 22, and 23. And by the way, 21, 22, and 23 is what the actual switches were numbered. If you went and you physically looked at those switches, you would have seen the big red indicator saying track switch 21, track switch 22, and track switch 23 physically on the switches the day conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. So why would employees who were working with conductor trainee Jason Clooney the day he was killed be referring to these switches as track switch 12, 13, and 15 in the witness statements, not 21, 22, 23? That, folks, in my opinion, can only be due to the fact that either work instructions or materials tied to that particular work location, as far as maps, operating instructions, whatever, had to be outdated. You have to remember, a locomotive engineer generally does not get out of the locomotive. So if I arrive to a site and it's basically dark out, or it's, because it was dark when these people were working at the last location that day, which was called Murphy's. So, if I'm a locomotive engineer, am I necessarily going to notice all of the numbers on the track switches? I'm not necessarily, as a locomotive engineer, the one who needs to pay attention to the labeling on the track switches. That's more the job of the conductor, who's the one who would flip those switches. So explain to me how, you can have 3 crew members who are working with conductor trainee Jason Clooney that day are not referring to track switches 21, 22, and 23 as these switches were labeled physically, but as track switches 12, 13, and 15. That can only be due to inaccurate information somewhere on the paperwork, either in the maps or the operations manual, in the work instructions for the day, whatever. They were getting those wrong track switch numbers somewhere. And even though in this little snippet here, 2.3, noted facts, is from the Transport Canada Health and Safety Officer report. And this was found on page 30 of that report, where he says here, I've underlined, the track switch, the 23 switch, and then it says also known as TS15 in common parlance of crews. Well, it cannot possibly be common parlance of crews. 2 of the people being trained that day were new to the territory. The locomotive engineer, who was physically at the controls when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, was a qualified locomotive engineer new to the territory. So you can't be saying that for that guy, this track switch was known as track switch 15 in common parlance. He didn't work in that territory. He would not have known the number, the name, the common parlance name of that switch. And the same would have been true for conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Can you imagine being a conductor trainee, forced to work in the dark, unsupervised, in unfamiliar territory, when your other 3 crew members are referring to switch numbers that are not the switch numbers on the physical switches themselves, and you're being asked to flip switches this way or that way, and there can be massive confusion as to which switch is which, because they're not labeled according not only, I would suspect, to the materials being used by your other 3 crew members, but in the way other crew members may be talking to you. If I'm the supervising conductor and I've got lots of years at CN Rail, and I've always referred to this as track switch 15, would I be now referring to it as track switch 23? What was the actual communications used on the radio recordings? Was conductor trainee Jason Clooney being asked to flip track switch 23, but being told on the radio it's track switch 15 when there is no track switch 15? So you've got a conductor trainee here that could have been totally confused as to which switch was which, because the labeling did not match what might have been in the instructions or the operations manual, or the work orders for that day, and it may not have matched not only the written stuff, but the oral stuff being told to you by your supposed supervising conductor as far as the instructions you were being given. So imagine conductor trainee Jason Clooney being your child, out in the middle of nowhere, in the dark, unsupervised, in unfamiliar territory, with nobody to double check his work, and when instructions coming at you, that could have been extremely confusing. And this brings also, when health and safety officer Kowalski tries to mention this track switch was known as in Carmen parlance as track switch 15. Well, excuse me, but I have a huge issue with that. Why would CN Rail be training new employees with common parlance, outdated materials? You're training employees who are new to the territory, and you're going to refer to this as track switch 15 instead of the actual switch number on the switch, track switch 23? Forget the common parlance. Why would anybody at CN Rail be using common parlance to train new employees to that territory? And that would have been two of them that day, conductor trainee Jason Clooney and the locomotive engineer who was new to the territory and at the controls when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. Why would you be using common parlance to train these new employees new to the territory and not what's actually on the switches? Unless that might be all that was available to you in the operations manual, the work instructions for the day, whatever. So that would more likely, in my opinion, explain why 3 witnesses after the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney were referring not to track switch 23, but to track switch 15 in their witness statements, and why I believe it was in the supervising conductor's statement, the other 2 switches were not referred to as track switch 21 and track switch 22, but rather as track switch 12 and track switch 13. So another massive, massive issue when it comes to the training of frontline employees in the rail industry. Is it any wonder why it has become so deadly as far as an industry? And where is Transport Canada in oversight functions that you can have track switch numbers that are so out of date and materials that are so out of date? Where is Transport Canada in its oversight role as far as compliance audits? Because to have outdated materials anywhere in safety critical issues, like the proper labeling of switches so that they match what's in the operations manuals, what's in the maps, what's in the work instructions or job descriptions for the day, where are the compliance audits? That's what I'd like to know. And compliance audits, since Transport Canada has that extended jurisdiction involving the labor code, if Transport Canada is the one who's there to enforce the labor code, clearly they're not enforcing it if stuff like this was going on. The labor code has never been the priority, clearly, of Transport Canada. And that, in my opinion, is the huge issue in all of this, because Transport Canada took over the function of the Ministry of Labor. And so the Ministry of Labor is pretty well out of the rail industry, making it such that the corruption can just be magnified and then swept under the carpet. All these violations of critical laws can just be swept under the carpet. And again, remember, I mentioned that the Transport Canada Health and Safety Officer had given an oh so special presentation to CN Rail. A presentation that would have been paid for by taxpayers. When I got that presentation, it was completely blacked out. I suspect those were all the labor code violations that were being discussed in that presentation. Just my hunch, because these issues, the health and safety officer ended up issuing 4 contraventions to CN Rail as far as labor code violations, and those would then be addressed in 2016, years later, after the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. 3 years later, it would finally make its way to the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada, where their facts were twisted and even more dangerous precedents were allowed to be set. And we're going to get into the whole Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal issue. I'll probably cover that after I cover the last attempt to update the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. There's just so much to cover, folks. But that Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal decision in matters pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, which happened 3 years after his death. You know, as they say in politics, never waste a good crisis. We had a guy who died. And the rail carriers, and I would argue in this case, also the TCRC and Transport Canada, used that as an opportunity to further water down, precedents, whatever, in court, or laws that were there to protect frontline rail workers. So, again, I would argue the presentation pertaining to labor code violations, which I suspect is what was given to Transport Canada by Health and Safety Officer Tyrone Kowalski, that entire presentation, which was blacked out, needs to be released. It was paid for by taxpayers. We need to see what was in that documentation. Okay, so in continuing with this issue of outdated materials being used, not only in training in the classroom, but also in the field, materials used by frontline rail workers in the performance of their daily tasks. When I asked my child, as I was investigating all of this, could it be that job aids or other materials used by frontline rail workers could be out of date and showing wrong switch numbers? Well, I was told that indeed they could be out of date by years at the time of the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney and when I was investigating all of these issues. And I did that over years. And that the issue was that even the newer switches may not even be labeled properly, and that some could be missing labels altogether. Folks, as a parent, I can tell you that's a huge issue. And, not just as a parent, if you're a rail investor, you should have an issue with this. If you're a rail customer, you should have an issue with this. If you're a rail customer, like at the grain elevator where conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, it's not your job to make sure that the switches that are on your location match what's in CN Rail's manuals or job descriptions or work assignments for the day. That's CN Rail's job to match what's on those physical switches. And so, just a huge issue for all rail families, not just the frontline rail workers. Investors, customers, you should be as concerned about this as the frontline rail workers. And so, the other issue is that rail workers can be working, not just at a site where there's only one or two switches. And you can see that a problem with labeling switches properly is an issue even with only one or two switches. One mislabeled switch in the field is one too many. But there are several yards that can have hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds of switches. And our rail workers are expected to work in this environment where the switches may be mislabeled, improperly labeled, like they might be on the side somewhere, just kind of barely labeled. They're not, it's not obvious what the track switch number is, whatever. So I asked my child, how do you know if you're turning the right switch then? And the response was, I quote, well, often we just look at one another and say, that one? Is it this one? And then we kind of have to agree, maybe, two workers. I guess it must be this one. The brakeman and the conductor probably determine it's that one. What if they're wrong? Huge issue, folks. This is inexcusable. CN Rail, for years, had said that it had the 5-star gold standard training program for its frontline rail workers. Really? Really? Based on everything we've seen, I wouldn't even give it 1 star. My personal opinion. When it comes to all these outdated materials and stuff that we see, not only in classrooms, but in the field, as was the case clearly at the time that conductor trainee Jason Clooney, and this stuff, folks, was going on for years. That is obvious. I don't buy any excuse by any regulator or any, rail carrier for what was going on, because the fact is that any rail worker, if you have so much as one inaccurate page missing, or a missing page, or a missing bulletin in your operations manual, you can be hit automatically with 25 demerit points if somebody is auditing your particular operations manual. And when somebody wants to get rid of someone, for example, I'm sure my child is probably pretty targeted at CN Rail right now. I know that to be a fact. But anyways, you can be sure that my child gets special treatment, because when you get off a trip and a conductor is being questioned by the yard master, so how good is that locomotive engineer? Are they dangerous? Whatever. My child has had more than one coworker come up and say, they're gunning for you. Really? The fact is, so I've always told my child, document absolutely everything. Be totally on the up and up. Don't trust any of them. Document everything. So if my child can get 25 demerit points for having something wrong in their training manuals, or whatever, having your boots not tied properly, at 60 demerit points, they can be fired. And so rail carriers use this demerit system to get rid of people they think might cause them trouble. My child hasn't had any demerits. Anything against my child. Because, I've told them, make sure you follow the rules and the laws. I don't care what CN tells you, make sure you follow the laws, because they would love nothing more than to get rid of my child in the rail industry. Now, there are those who may say, why do you allow your child to stay in that industry? Well, I've always told my child, you know what? Somebody needs to address these issues. You can't just run from the problems Never let them get uncovered or exposed and then allow other people to walk into this environment. How would you feel when the next person gets killed? And so, yes, as hard as it is, you stay in that environment and you help change it. My father was a coroner, and I've said it over and over. Families have a right to the truth. And so do rail investors and rail customers and taxpayers. And so, if a rail worker can be hit for, your boots aren't tied, 25 demerits, and you can be fired at 60, why is it that management doesn't get fired for their complete criminal negligence in all of these issues? How is it that they don't train supervising conductors in how to properly train or supervise a conductor trainee, as was clearly exposed as a fact in the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal hearing tied to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney? That was a decision known as 2016 OHS TC 20. So frontline rail workers, they face harsh discipline. And remember, it's very much in the financial interest of rail carriers to churn the workforce. Get rid of these people. Bring them in, fake qualify them, use them as cheap labor, get rid of them, bring in a new batch, because they're a lot less expensive than our other full-time rail workers. And if you're a union, you had better know those types of practices are watering down the strength of the union, because you have no members that are really sticking around. No members that really understand the issues. No members devoted to addressing the issues, as everybody runs like a rat when they find out just how bad it is, right? It takes a very strong person to stay there and address these issues. And if I always say my child, it's to protect my child, because I do not doubt there could be massive backlash against my child. And Transport Canada has been warned over and over again. Backlash against my child, I will not tolerate. And I don't have just the rail scandal. Folks, I have 3 massive scandals impacting U.S. national security. And this one isn't even the worst one. And so I've told Transport Canada and the corrupt government of Canada over and over again, you had better tread lightly, because anything that is viewed as backlash against my child in these issues, because my child was basically told you should stay there and help address these issues. You want to backlash CN Rail? You want to backlash Transport Canada? You hit the wrong family. I have enough to probably bankrupt the government of Canada. Not just because of this scandal, but because of others. There's a reason President Trump is so upset with the government of Canada. And I'll do another video on negotiations between Canada and the U.S. and what my position is on that. But getting back to this, labor code violations, they abound. And where's Transport Canada? Transport Canada, you wanted to have oversight of the labor code for the rail industry. Do your job. There are a lot of people, in my opinion, at Transport Canada and at the Transportation Safety Board and Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada who quite frankly belong in jail. There's no simple way to put it. These issues are so huge and massive. How can you not have a proper training program for remote control locomotive operations for over 30 years when there are so many incidents or deaths tied to remote locomotive operations in the rail industry? The whole attempted rewrite of the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, what I'll be covering after I do these materials on deadly training materials, we're going to get into the previous attempt to overhaul the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. And you will see, folks, how can you have for 30 years missing training programs that are so critical to the rail industry? That attempted overhaul resulted from a Mackyard incident, a CN Rail Mackyard incident outside of Toronto in 2007. So in that time period, 2007, 2009, is when they were attempting to overhaul the Railway Qualification Standards Regulation. And that attempt was a complete and total public scam, in my humble opinion. And I'll be showing you exactly why. So, again, labor violations abound. Violations of critical rail regulations and acts abound. Where is Transport Canada? There's a reason that Transport Canada wants to water down its oversight role even more. And that cannot be allowed via this new proposed Railway Employee Qualification Standard Regulations overhaul. And I'm very serious in this issue. Frontline rail workers will need to prepare for a class action lawsuit. There is no doubt about it. If that new regulation goes through the way it's intended right now, based on what I've read, rail workers, your already horrible work environment, in my opinion, is going to get even worse. So, again, all the rules and regulations in the rail industry, folks, they're pretty well written in blood. And now we're going to be maybe allowing for more blood to be shed because Transport Canada and the government of Canada is trying to shield itself from massive liabilities. It's not going to happen. Okay, when it comes to, again, violations of so many laws, there's also a note in the Health and Safety Officer Kowalski's final report, which, it stated that although the safety management systems documentation was requested of CN Rail, by the time that the investigation was over, by Transport Canada's Health and Safety Officer, and I think he investigated for like 10 months or something before his report came out, that documentation had still not been provided by CN Rail. So the question is, why is that? Could it be because maybe it didn't exist, or it was inaccurate or outdated? Would that be it? I have a hunch it might be. But, there's something that, okay, Health and Safety Officer Kowalski said he requested it, but it wasn't provided. Well, if you're a government investigator, I do believe that you have the legal right and authority to request a court order to have that documentation released. So why is a court order not being given to CN Rail to release its documentation pertaining to safety management systems? Those safety management systems are supposed to be in place. The laws requiring that date back to 2001. So how up to date were those safety management systems at CN Rail, given what we've seen so far as the outdated documentation and outdated track switch number documents and whatever? I'm not training my supervising conductors in how to supervise a trainee. What do your safety management systems have to say about proper training for conductors supervising conductor trainees? I'd like to know. So again, why did the health and safety officer not get a court order forcing the disclosure of these required documents in the death investigation of conductor trainee Jason Clooney? Okay, it's brought up as a point in the final report, which, by the way, is not public. You have to request that report through Freedom of Information. It's not a report you can find just online, like the Transportation Safety Board report. So a lot of people don't even know that these types of reports are out there when there's a death or whatever. So was the health and safety officer told, don't make waves? Was there a legal reason for not obtaining critical information? Why did Transport Canada not force the release of this critical safety management systems documentation? I think I have the answer. Okay, what we have at the bottom of this page here is a screen print from a Government of Canada website. And this is actually, I think it's part of Transport Canada's website. But anyways, you can see here it's a Railway Safety Act review that was done for 2017 to 2018. And basically, it was showing that safety management system documentation enforcement by Transport Canada for rail carriers is still, even in 2018, a challenge for Transport Canada. Really? Would that be because the rail carriers or Transport Canada are what I call rail partners in crime, and Transport Canada has basically washed its hands of oversight roles? Actually, in the new proposed regulation, which they're in the process of updating, and this is one of the issues I have with that, there's comments in there that the safety management systems is enough to ensure, proper compliance with laws and whatever. I think it's something to that effect. I have to look at the actual wording when we get into those videos. But, and so, nice way to wash our hands. If we're Transport Canada, we're just going to depend on proper safety management systems, documentation, being in the background with the rail carriers, and we're just going to take their word for it that it's up to date and complete, and that it covers all critical tasks and whatever, things like basic training, complete documentation, accurate documentation, up-to-date documentation, proper track switches, whatever, right? It's all in there, right? I don't think so. Certainly not at the time of the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And according to this report, which was, looking at stuff in 2018, safety management systems was still a challenge for Transport Canada to have implemented in the field. Really? That documentation was required dating back to 2001. So, I'm sorry. Forget the excuses of Transport Canada and rail carriers. There is no excuse for this. And when I'm telling you that, in my opinion, they're looking to water down oversight functions, this is one critical area. And it is too critical to allow this to remain in the hands of only the rail carriers. You need to overhaul Transport Canada, absolutely. And those oversight functions need to remain with Transport Canada. They cannot just be handed over to rail carriers, because that's going to make this rail industry exponentially more dangerous and with zero accountability. So, would you like to invest in the rail industry if that's going to be the case? All those big pension and equity funds that have billions? potentially to lose. And this is not just a CN Rail issue, folks. It's also a CP issue, CPKC now. And, I'd love to know what it's like in the U.S. As far as, if there's a requirement for such documentation, whatever. But definitely a huge issue for any rail carrier operating in Canada. And those, if you operate in Canada and you're a Class 1 rail carrier, that would include all the U.S. Class 1 rail carriers. If Canada required this documentation, it would not have been required only of CN and CP. It would have been required of all Class 1 rail carriers operating in Canada. So, again, huge issue. And why is this such a challenge for Transport Canada after almost 2 decades? Good question. So, I'm just saying, folks, prepare, because we cannot allow what is now being proposed for the new Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. They're trying to make it look like we're going to overhaul this. We're going to include more training for more employee categories, the remote control locomotive operator, rail traffic control. We're making it look like we're on top of this. Right, Minister Freeland? You're on top of this, right? You've known about this for years. But now you're going to overhaul the regulation to try and shield yourself, former Minister of Finance Freeland? You're trying to shield yourself from massive liabilities, right? That's why you really need to overhaul this. Only you think that we're going to make it look like we're doing stuff, but really it's going to be another opportunity to water things down and make the rail industry even more dangerous. The government of Canada is extremely good at deception, in my humble opinion. And yes, I have the documentation to prove that. Folks, when I say that I strongly suspected that safety management systems were not what they needed to be in the rail industry, and that problem really, it's at the heart of oversight functions for Transport Canada, and also, legal requirements that are imposed upon rail carriers as far as how they're supposed to operate. Because again, they're supposed to have compliance audits. If they're publicly traded companies, you had better be operating in compliance with all laws under which you operate. And it would have been Transport Canada's responsibility to ensure proper compliance audits, not just in matters pertaining to rail regulation, but also in matters pertaining to labor code violations, since Transport Canada took over that function from the Ministry of Labor. And just the fact that, since 1987, let's see, that's 13, okay, we have now had 38 years go by since the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation has been updated. Almost 40 years, folks. And we still don't have proper remote control locomotive operations training on file with Transport Canada. In 2017, December 2017, someone was killed in a remote control locomotive operation. And I think again, I can't remember the year, there was another person killed, I think in Montreal, tied to remote control locomotive operations. But anyways, more than one person has died. And the fact is, if safety management systems were what they were, would we not have had proper training programs on file, approved by Transport Canada, on file with Transport Canada? Why was it that in 2019, then Minister of Transportation decided to put out the 2019 Guideline to Remote Control Operations. That was just a guideline. It wasn't a regulation. And if you look at my first videos having to do with acts, regulations, rules, and guidelines, and what the critical difference is between those, a guideline is not enforceable in court. Acts and regulations are, but a rule or a guideline is really not enforceable in court. And that video you will see is per a Government of Canada website for the Ministry of Justice. So, again, we're going to pretend that we're doing something. We're going to put it out there. Oh, look, we have these new remote control locomotive operation guidelines. More watering down, folks, of anything that's out there to protect frontline rail workers. And when Minister of Garneau put those out, I brought up the point to him that his new guidelines appeared to violate a lot of provisions of the Railway Safety Act. And it had illegally changed key definitions found in acts, okay, and that were still in force and had not been repealed. And that, it was either in acts or regulations or both. And those key definitions override any rules or guidelines. Regulations and acts, those are enforceable in court. Rules or guidelines are not. So when he's tried to change the definition of this or that, and I will again provide that documentation in another series of videos on robust enforcement at Transport Canada. R-O-B-U-S-T, robust. For me, that stands for really obviously broken and untrustworthy in supervision and training. Robust enforcement at Transport Canada. And so I analyzed Minister Garneau's new guidelines for remote control locomotive operations. And I don't think he was too happy with the results of my analysis, but it was also provided to the Rail Union in Canada and a lot of other groups. So, Minister Freeland, I understand your need to overhaul the regulations, but if you think you're going to be changing key definitions or, watering down oversight rules or roles for Transport Canada, not happening, hon. You've been caught, and frontline rail workers are going to know that the gig's up, hon. So, personally, in my opinion, all of this is no longer just incompetence, but it's truly breach of public trust and criminal negligence causing death, as well as financial fraud. These people know exactly what they're doing. They know that Transport Canada has been a real partner in crime for years, as has the Transportation Safety Board. And that's why when you have a conductor trainee that gets killed, those ones really show the problems in the industry, because you're going way back to the very beginning. And that's another issue, folks, that I have with the new proposed regulation that Transport Canada is trying to put forward. They want training records to only be kept for 6 years. Ooh, I'm sorry. No. You've got frontline rail workers who've been fake qualified, and they have not been properly qualified for decades. My child, even though I told Transport Canada my child was fake qualified, like conductor trainee Jason Clooney, I suspect was also fake qualified the day he was killed, that's what they were doing, because they still refused to release those last 5 pages of the supervising conductor witness statement. And I really think The reason for that is because the word in the field from other people I knew in the area, was that he was being qualified the day he was killed. Just a rumor that was in the field. Can I prove it? Maybe only by the release of those last 5 pages of the conductor witness statement, which have yet to be released. But I'm telling you, when I raised my issues that my child was qualified with basically 0 yard training, 0 yard shifts, ooh, well, my child wasn't given that proper yard training that should have been given. On we go. Why not be retrained? And we're going to get into the whole issue of remote control locomotive operations and massive issues with what training was there at CN Rail, and oversight issues by Transport Canada. Remote control locomotive operations is going to be a whole other set of videos. Another critical issue. But I'm just telling you folks, the liabilities are massive, and you have to be aware. Every crisis, every death is an opportunity, in my opinion, for them to water down the laws, either by attempting to rewrite regulation or by bogus Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal hearing decisions, what I would call prefixed, before one word was even spoken in that hearing. In my opinion, the outcome had been determined. We're going to get into all of those issues too. So, folks, you know, the whole thing, the review of the Railway Safety Act in matters pertaining to safety management documentation. And again, if it is what it was, should have been, this was a review in 2018. And, you know, Transport Canada is still struggling with having those safety management systems in place for rail carriers. Well, the fact that remote control locomotive operations don't even appear as part of the regulation for frontline rail worker training, and the same is true for rail traffic controllers, they're not in that regulation either. Seems to me that that might be a pretty gaping hole that might exist in safety management systems for rail carriers. And I'm not saying just CN. I suspect all of them operating in Canada. If the regulation was there, if it was what it needed to be, why still such a challenge for Transport Canada? Good question. Well, Ms. Friedland, our new Minister of Transportation, would you have a good answer to that? Because inquiring minds would like to know. Okay, so here I'm providing for you the link which provides Transport Canada's what I call excuses response in to that review of the Railway Safety Act that was done in 2017, 2018. But if you look here, when it comes to the summary recommendation number 16, okay, if you look at, they're talking about Transport Canada's rail safety programs undergo a significant strategic transformation in role and safety approach. The change should maintain current strengths. I'd love to know what those are. Of the department in regulation, inspection, and enforcement, while transforming its role and capacity to, big number 1A here, improve the implementation of strategic management systems and promote safety culture. In my opinion, they get a failing grade on that one. But anyways, that's clearly an issue and a safety recommendation. But it's Transport Canada's reply that I want you to take note of. And that's what follows here. Okay, so the writers of that report, they gave their recommendation number 16, and then here is Transport Canada's response, which was right below that recommendation. They say, um, I'm, I'm just going to read this second paragraph here. We have also begun work to modernize our legislative, regulatory, and oversight regimes on a department-wide basis, work that aligns with the report's call for a transformation in our role and approach to rail safety oversight. Okay, well, that all sounds really nice on paper, folks. But again, beware the deception, because what looks nice on paper may not be what you get in reality. And if you look at what's being proposed in that overhaul of the railway employee qualification standards, regulations, and oversight and stuff, you know, even the TCRC has issues with what they're proposing as far as oversight. So um, be careful. Don't be fooled by sounds so good on paper, because in my opinion, what's going to come out of this is Transport Canada is trying to wash its hands of a whole lot of oversight functions, because they're realizing they've got massive liabilities because they have so failed in this department um, for decades, literally for decades. And so that's where things stand, folks. Be very, very aware of what's coming down the pipeline as they work to overhaul the railway employee qualification standards regulation. If you're a frontline rail worker, a rail union, if you are a rail investor, a rail customer, you have a lot at stake in what's coming down the pipeline. Fair warning. Okay, so this is going to end part 3 of deadly training materials. And, you know, I know that for some of you, you may find that these videos are a little bit long, but there's just so much information to cover that I can't leave it to just, 15 or 20-minute videos. My goal is to provide critical safety information for all rail families, and, 300 videos would take me far too long. And there is a lot of work as far as, doing these videos, updating, or, posting them, whatever. So, I can only do what I can do as I try to help people understand these issues. So I try and keep them a little bit shorter, but a lot of times it's just not possible. So I hope you'll be able to deal with that and get past those types of issues and focus on the issues, the critical issues. So like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you on part 4. Have a great day.